Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, as April said, please, if you have questions, ask. The mobile office hours format is basically 20 minutes to a half hour of a subject that is interesting, and then, as she said, a half hour question. So please bring on your questions. Hopefully the topic that I have brings up some questions, but if you just have random questions to ask, let me know. And if your question is too deep, we are also always looking for office hours topics. So if you have any topics to bring up, or if your question is too deep to answer, we can always make it one of those topics that we cover in detail in 20 minutes to a half hour at the beginning. That being said, I have what I think is a pretty interesting one coming up next month, which is on floating action buttons. Floating action buttons are an interesting design idiom that has some interesting accessibility characteristics and problems. But for today, we are talking Accessible Carousel, and let's get started. Let me see, get this out of the way. All right, sorry, you might not have been able to see, but I was boxing with some of my Zoom controls there. So, all right, so what are we talking about? I know I started with accessible carousels as the main topic, but really what we're talking about is something that I call empathy-driven development. And the basic idea being having empathy for users, particularly for people with disabilities, is an important part of the development process, because otherwise you can lead yourself down some sticky holes when it comes to the actual technical implementation of some of these things. It can be really difficult if you don't truly understand the user need. And it just happens to be that how you go about building an accessible carousel widget is an interesting use case or study of empathy-driven development really being able to help you out there. And so the final thing we're talking about is how application of empathy makes this process a lot easier, and the difference between what you'll find is a sympathetic approach to accessibility is different from an empathy-driven approach to accessibility. And empathy in this case is really important because it makes your job a lot easier. So as we're talking, I want to define empathy. I want to start figuring out what does it mean to have empathy for users. And I want you to reflect on the following statements. So which of the following are true? I've turned on VoiceOver. I've purchased a switch control device. I've forced myself to drive the UI of a product I've developed with just a keyboard. I can list more than 2 assistive technologies or accessibility settings for the platform that I develop on. These are sympathetic behaviors, and that's not wrong. That's not bad. But it's important to note that these things do not create empathy as you're going through your development process. And I'm not discouraging developers from going in and turning on VoiceOver and going in and seeing what it is to use your app with a switch control device. But it's important to note that these actions do not inherently create empathy, they create sympathy. And sympathy isn't often super valuable when it comes to how to actually implement things, right? It can help you understand difficulties that you've created in using your content, but understanding the solutions and how to get to those solutions is different, and that requires empathy. Sympathy and an affinity, association, or relationship between persons or things wherein whatever affects one similarly affects the other. You can certainly gain an understanding of the ways in which an application is broken by developing sympathy, but it may be difficult to come to the proper solutions without empathy. And let's go on. So which of the following are true? I've watched a blind girl use NVDA. I've witnessed a man with cerebral palsy use a tablet. I've watched Berkir. Berkir's a good friend, used to work at DQ. I watched Berkir use a braille board. I have done research with users of more than 2 assistive technologies or accessibility settings for the platform that I develop on. Those are empathetic. Those are things that create empathy, right? And so if you were going through and as you were listening that first time that I was reading off that list, if you thought that that created empathy, it doesn't. It actually creates sympathy. And don't take this the wrong way. The ability to sympathize with people with disabilities is amazing and is a great first step. But sympathy can only really lead you to understanding the ways in which your application is broken. It is empathy that will lead you to understanding how your application needs to be fixed. And that's not always true. There are some things in which you can do kind of a blanket voiceover pass and spot pictures that might need to be labeled, or simple controls that aren't associated. And you can go through and a developer can be expected to do those things and come up with some reasonably accessible content. But true accessibility comes from understanding user need and really digging in and getting to that level where you have empathy. And developers, honestly, maybe shouldn't always be expected to go through those processes. This may be something that product managers and QA and designers need to go through. But when you're talking about creating a accessible application from beginning to end, developers are going to end up in a position where, and I've seen this happen, where a project manager is actually that sympathetic person, is actually that person that doesn't quite understand what needs to happen, and they are handed a requirement, a developer's handed a requirement, and that requirement doesn't necessarily make sense. And that's where you can get into places where a lack of empathy can actually really waste resources, because a project manager handing down a requirement that doesn't quite make sense in the hands of a developer that just wants to follow that requirement. But if that requirement is very difficult to implement, which is why, by the way, we're talking about accessible carousels, because I've seen this happen, you can end up with a dramatic waste of resources. And that's why the accessible carousel is an interesting study, because if you have just some empathy for people with disabilities, you can understand the real problem and come to completely different solutions than if you take the sympathetic approach. So I work for Deque. Deque is an accessibility company, but our customers are not businesses or developers. Our customers are the users with disabilities. If we are not making tangible differences in the lives of our customers, those who pay us will eventually stop. The best way to have a tangible influence on the world of accessibility is to aggressively seek empathy for users, and that's what I'm going to encourage you to do. And that is what we're going to do within the rounds of an interesting case study. So now let's talk about how empathy drives and affects the development process. Can we spot, as engineers, product managers, QA, put whatever role you want, can we spot times when we did not properly apply empathy to a given control or user interface component? So let's talk about the carousel problem. The carousel problem is really interesting because if you take what I would consider the sympathetic approach, right? Remember sympathy versus empathy. So for labeling of images, if you're going through and you're trying to label your images properly, there is no difference between the sympathetic approach and the empathetic approach. A picture doesn't have an image, or a picture doesn't have a description. You go in, you add it, and end of story, right? And maybe every once in a while you end up in this scenario where you can look at an image and say, that's informative. I should wrap it or associate it with a label that's already on it, and you can do that. But there's no real time wasted. There's little value to the customer to getting that scenario perfect, and there's little value to the business in terms of saving money and not doing the correct approach, right? It takes a developer 5 seconds to add a description to an image. But the carousel problem is really interesting, because in that Venn diagram of the correct way to solve this problem is also the cheapest way to solve this problem. So the carousel problem. Here we have some class 1 level information at the top. And we have a series of items here, right? And so you have the current item, the second item, any odd number of items. So notice I picked 1,000 here. There's a lot. And as a user, as a talkback user, what's going to happen is I'm going to be focusing on this one up here, and then I'm going to have to swipe right, potentially 1,000 or an infinite number of times to get down to that second level of information. And there are a lot of things we can do to make this better, a lot of things we can do to improve this experience. But that's the problem that we're talking about here, right? Is we have all of this infinite scroll of content going off, and talkback or voiceover is going to focus these things one at a time, and this can be really, really damaging, because as a talkback user, you have the talkback or voiceover user, you do have that touch to explore thing where you can just hold your finger and maybe you can scroll up, but not everybody has the capability of doing that. Some people are really truly confined to that linear sequential navigation method. Someone who's using talkback in conjunction with a joystick or a keyboard, right? Or perhaps a switch control user that where the only way they can do it is this kind of sequential navigation thing. And this is a real problem. This is a very significant problem that needs to be solved. So some notes. This obviously does not apply if the carousel is the only content. So in the example of like where you're exploring images or something to when the content really is the only thing, that doesn't exhibit this problem. That is a separate concern. If a carousel isn't the terrible control and there are times when it is appropriate to use it, the real problem here is a potentially infinite collection of focusable items that is blocking you from getting to the content after it, right? And those items are less important than the items around them. 1,000 class 3 or class 4 focusable items around some class 1 headings is going to prevent people from using content, and prevent people from having a bad experience, and prevent people from having a good experience. And it's going to separate the visual capable user experience from someone who is a user using TalkBack, right? Because as sighted users, we do not have to go in and engage with these 1,000 things. In fact, most of the time we skip over them, right? Most of the time you're looking at a carousel like this, and I have a more substantive example after that I'll show you. But most of the time as sighted users, we don't care about these items. We're here and we want to move on to the next thing, and we just skip over those, right? And a talkback user has a very different experience with those things. A talkback user is going to have to scroll through all of those things before they get to that next level of information. And so that's a problem. I'm not bashing on carousels. The real problem here is having thousands of focusable controls that are unimportant and that I want to ignore, right? And a carousel just happens to be an interesting example of that problem. So the problem in a nutshell: the typical user experience of a carousel is such that users feel free to ignore the minutia of the carousel's content when desirable. A carousel represents size, scope, and discovery. Any user who is forced to engage with a sizable amount of class 4 content, the items within the carousel, before engaging with the class 1 content around it is not getting the equivalent value, right? And let's see how that plays out, right? So the carousel problem, a more relatable example. And so let's say that you have a social networking platform, right? You have a social networking platform, and at the top, our first kind of class 1 content here is discover new friends, right? So we have a heading up here, and we say, all right, so discover new friends. You got John, you got Amy, and you probably know John and Amy. You know, you might not want to friend them right now, but you see that picture of John and you're like, oh yeah, I remember him from high school. Oh, that's cool. And as a sighted user, we're within this gray box, and maybe we tap on John's face there, but probably we just skip over it, right? We're like, all right, hi, nice to see you, John, but nah, not today. And you go on and talk to your sister, right? That is the sighted user experience of the discover new friends thing. And 90% of the time you skip over John and Amy, and you're just like, no, I'm going to talk to my sister, right? But notice that for the talkback rendering of this, for the voiceover, for the assistive technology rendering of this thing, they got to go to John, and they got to go to Amy, and they got to go to Fred, and there's a huge long list of things, and you know, like a friend of a friend from 5th grade homeroom went to Seattle, found this person in a Starbucks. It's ridiculous. You got to go through all these things, and then you can get to the point where you talk to your sister. And if you program this poorly, this content here can actually be a blocker. You can actually get into a position where it is essentially impossible to get to the point where you talk to your sister. And assistive technologies have answers for some of these things, and we'll go into all of the different ways you can solve this problem. But it is difficult as users to understand when you're in one of these loops. And at the very least, if it's not a hardcore accessibility blocker, it's a very, very bad user experience. So accessible carousel, there's a distinct difference between, so we're starting to talk about solutions here, right? We're starting to talk about solutions. And there's a distinct difference between a sympathetic engineer and an empathetic engineer's solution to the accessible carousel problem. And I know this because I have gone through this process with one of our engineers who is getting ramped up accessibility here at DQ, a couple of engineers at companies that we consult with. I've seen the sympathetic engineer approach versus the empathetic engineer approach happen 3 times in a row. Each of those 3 times, a sympathetic engineer with great intentions was approaching this problem in a way that was going to cost their business a lot of money unnecessarily. And we're seriously talking about taking 1 month of effort down to 2 days of effort. It's that dramatic of a difference, because some of these problems, some of these things are really difficult to get correctly. Within the iOS and the Android accessibility APIs are these kind of obscure ways of handling things, and it just so happens that the carousel control, think UI collection view in iOS, think pager views in Android. It just so happens that these controls have been in development parlance hacked to do these things, and they're not designed to do them. And so when you have developers coming in and they've implemented a collection view as a carousel, or they've implemented a pager view, which is a natural thing for a developer to do, but that's not the real intent of those controls from a user experience thing. And that's the danger of native mobile application development is developers are really kind of given back-end APIs compared to those in like the web accessibility world. They're given like these kind of back-end APIs, and they're really allowed to do whatever they want with them. It just so happens that a lot of these carousel implementations in the wild are built off of these kind of back-end APIs, back-end user interface APIs that really aren't quite designed to solve the problems that they're solving, and shoehorning those in and building the technical stuff to try and solve the user experience the way a sympathetic engineer would is very, very difficult. And I'm serious when I say we're talking a month of effort down to 2 days of effort. In every scenario, this approximate thing played out. So let's talk about how a sympathetic engineer would solve it. Let's talk about how that thing that is going to cost a month of effort and why it's so damaging and why it doesn't actually solve the user problem, right? So a sympathetic engineer maybe groups things together in informative chunks, right? So when you go back to the, when you go back to this, right? In the Discover New Friends, you got John, and John might have a last name, and John might have a comment link, and John might have a friends, and there's probably a lot of different focusable targets within the John box. And so a sympathetic engineer, the first thing they're going to do is, oh, okay, hold on a second, I got this. I can group these things together so that at least a talkback developer focuses the whole John box before they goes in and does that. But what we've done, let's say this is 1,000 friends. All right, so we've taken our focusable targets in the carousel from 5,000, 5 boxes for John, 5 boxes for Amy. We've taken it from 5,000 down to 1,000. Cool, still pretty bad, but cool. All right, so a sympathetic ensures the number of elements in the list are uniquely identifiable. Okay, so we have this carousel, and maybe we can uniquely identify those things. Well, uniquely identifying elements helps because you can swipe through and ignore them quicker, and there's various types of carousels where that's helpful. And so you can, if you remember, oh, hey, that 10th friend of mine, that's an interesting one, right? I want to be able to get back to that 10th friend, Frank, because I might actually want to friend him sometime. I mean, that's cool, it's useful, but it still doesn't ultimately solve a lot of the problems, and we haven't solved the base user need. Tries to bring focus back to the carousel element that was last focused after navigating away. This is a big one, right? You go in and you're 500 deep into this random list of friends, and you're like, oh, hey, cool, okay, yeah, I want to make Frank my friend, but not today, But surely that one that I saw before Frank, yeah, surely I'll make her friend right now, right? And so that's cool. That's big. That's important. But still, it doesn't answer the user need because I still had to swipe 499 times to get to Shirley. And that's not ideal, right? So let's talk about what an empathetic engineer does to solve this problem, right? So we want to try to figure out, what do users get from that control when you're looking at a carousel, when you're looking at a way to discover friends, or a way to discover random goods on a shopping website, or a way to discover, like these are frequently, they're essentially advertising gimmicks, right? Where they say, hey, look, there's thousands of other things here that you can search through, right? And the thing that we get from that control as sighted users or as capable users is just this idea of scope and size. That's really all a carousel presents. I don't know about you guys and those on the call, but to me, when I'm searching through a carousel, very rarely do I get more than 4 or 5 things into a carousel. I might spot the top 3 things, and maybe I'm scrolling through a list of shopping things, and I get past, oh, hey, those are all video games that I'm interested in, and then it starts getting into some weird stuff, and I'm like, I'm out, and I didn't want to buy anything, right? Like, I will rarely spend more than 4 or 5 seconds in a carousel. And like I said, it's really an advertising thing. It's the purpose of it is to say, hey, there's a bunch of stuff here, and maybe every once in a while you're interested in buying one of those things or adding that friend, right? And so the value that we get from a carousel is not going through that deep, long list of things. The value we get from carousel is quick discovery and that advertising value. And not that, advertisements get a bad rap. Advertisements are valuable. I do buy those games once in a while, and I appreciate that they called them out, right? And so we need to make sure that we attach that value to that carousel. But not at the expense of having to swipe right 1,000 times to talk to my friend, right? Because talking to my friend is the thing that I want to do most of the time, or checking out if you're buying something, right? And then so what we do is, so now that we've spotted that there is clearly a discrepancy between the value that sighted users get from a carousel and the value that talkback users get from a carousel, we just need to figure out how to convey that information to a user with a disability. How do we take this kind of convoluted, nasty thing of 1,000 focusable boxes that doesn't actually achieve that? That's not the purpose of this thing. How do we make that 1,000 focusable boxes focus down into this idea of marketing value, size, scope, and maybe occasionally interacting with the first couple valuable elements, right? Because that's another thing that is becoming popular, is the idea of prioritizing and placing value. Like my Facebook example, the first 3 friends, those are probably degree 1 connections, right? But the farther you get down that friends list, or the farther you get down those items on the shopping cart, the less likely you are to want to interact with them. And then notice empathetic engineer doesn't do anything about finding a particular item within that carousel. That's not the job of a carousel. Think back to the social networking example. If you want to discover a particular friend, you go and you do that somewhere else, right? There's you can search for friends, or you can find friends of friends directly by going to their pages, right? There are other ways of solving those problems. An empathetic engineer doesn't try to allow people to go back to a specific item in a carousel, because that's not what the typical user experience is. I don't know about you, but when I am on Facebook or Instagram or Amazon, those things are different for me every time. If I go away, if I navigate away from that page, or even if I use the carousel to select a thing, when I come back to that carousel again, it has refreshed and is different. And putting that requirement on a thing when the user experience is actually creating user experience requirements for talkback users is not the correct thing. That's a sympathetic approach, not an empathetic approach. If a control isn't delivering that value to a sighted user, it doesn't have to deliver that value to a talkback user. It's a form of hand-holding that is actually really annoying to people with disabilities. And I've done a lot of research in that area, and it's not necessary. And like I said, in the case of the carousel example, there are other ways of identifying a specific thing. If your search is accessible and easy to use, that's a way more usable thing than going and finding that 400th item in exactly the same place again. That's not valuable, right? And that's something that I've actually seen happen at organizations where they take these requirements and they push them, and they're like, no, do this, because that's not accessibility. That's not reality. The reality is your search might need to be more accessible and more friendly to people with disabilities so that they can solve that problem. But a carousel does not solve that problem and shouldn't be made to. So I'm going to skip over some of the deep dive into the Mount Hospital research that I did on this topic, because it really all goes back to the things that I shared and how I got those results versus the results are different. I've shared the results, and if anyone's interested in talking Mount Hospital research, we can. But I'm going to skip over that slide to leave more time for questions. So let's talk about what an accessible carousel looks like and how we can solve all those problems. So remember from before, that graphic I had before, we had all those lists, right? And so what we've done is we've created a new mock-up, and notice that I've gotten rid of that gray box. There is no gray box. I don't have to represent the difference between how sighted users and non-sighted users are going to interact with those things, because I've unified that experience. Mock-up of focusable items. So previous is disabled when index is 0, right? So we have this heading up here at the top. This is our first class 1 item. In the example that I've used, this is going to be discover new friends, right? Previous, and when we're at the 0 with one of these items, previous is going to be disabled, although we're still going to focus it. You don't skip over buttons just because they're disabled. It's value knowing that they're there. In fact, it's very informative in this case, right? The fact that there's a previous disabled button here lets us know that there's a next button, and that there is some type of collection of content here, right? It's not just this first thing. And so going in to this content item with the understanding that there are more of those content items there is actually value in itself. Then we have the current item. So this would be Fred in my social networking example. So we have the current item. There are some actions that we can suppose, right? So there's maybe we can select Fred, maybe we can befriend Fred, maybe we can block Fred. Maybe Fred's a douchebag and we don't want to talk to him anymore. We can block him. There's all sorts of things that we can do with those things, and there's a list of actions here. And then there's next, right? And so remember the sympathetic engineers approach to solving this. The first thing that they did was group those things together. When you group those things together, you mask that information, the fact that you can do all of those actions, or you make those actions more difficult, right? In this layout, in this way of looking at this carousel, it's actually bad to group those together. We can freely have all of those actions and buttons separate because it paints a picture about the way that you interact with these things. The fact that there are a block and a friend and a message button down here individually becomes interesting information. Hey, here's Fred, and here's a lot of things you can do with Fred, right? And then you hit next, and you just go next until you've discovered the number of things that you want to discover. And maybe the next button, maybe there's an announcement that happens as you click next 10 times, and it says, hey, are you looking for a particular person? Try the search. It'll be easier to find a particular person or a particular item on Amazon or whatever, right? And then finally, you have the next focusable thing outside of the heading. So in the event that you want to discover randomly, you can just tap and click next. And by the way, these previous and next actions can still be swiped. I'm not talking about changing the way that non-talkback users use this thing. I'm just talking about adding these kind of previous and next. They're invisible buttons on the side of the screen, right? We don't actually have to change the user experience. A perfectly capable user can still just come and swipe and do whatever they want, and scroll across stuff. We don't have to change that experience for non-talkback users. This is just talking about the talkback user experience here. And these could be all virtual. They don't even have to show up on the screen. In fact, both Android and iOS provide protocols for rendering things only for assistive technologies. In iOS, this is going to be the UI Accessibility Container Protocol. In Android, this is going to be the View Delegate combined with the Accessibility Node Info Provider. You can do all of these things dynamically from the accessibility APIs without changing anything about the actual UI of your application. And then these are just notes here. You know, the previous is disabled when the index is 0. Next is disabled when the index is last. There's some accessibility options. Skip to the end, skip to the beginning, list headings for the specific elements, list the names of the people, right? If there are different things that you can do on those names, maybe we have a list of all of the names that you can go visit. And there's all sorts of things you can do to make this really, really powerful. But I think in general, when we're talking about carousels being things that we often want to ignore, this type of markup, look, we're one, two, three focusable things from getting to talk to our sister. And talk to our sister is the thing that we probably want to do 99% of the time we come across this control. And that's it. That's all I had for the topic today. So at this point, I welcome questions and discussion.
Great, thanks, Chris. First question here for you. What do you do when the class 3 content is the class 1 content?
When the class 3 content is the class 1 content. If the class 3 content, all right, let me make sure I understand the question. When the class 3 content, so what you're suggesting is that the class 3 content here, the 1,000 potential items, what happens when 1,000 potential items on the screen are class 1 content? You have completely subverted the definition of class 1 content, and that is impossible. So either I am not understanding that question, or we have a fundamental difference on the definition of class 1 and class 3 content. Either way, I'm going to need clarification. But my answer is you can't. It's not possible. Like I said, we've subverted the definition of class 1 and class 3 content at that point.
Great, thanks. So one attendee asks, just curious as to why you're focusing on talkback versus voiceover.
Just because it was top of mind. When you're talking to a large audience and going through and explaining both, it's difficult. There is no reason to have focused on it. Although it is important to note that this is a more prevalent problem in Android. Because Android introduced accessibility headings not too long ago, and in fact, there isn't wide device support for them yet, let alone, and I think TalkBack doesn't even respond particularly well to headings. In fact, the TalkBack user interface of the TalkBack user experience for heading navigation, I've never actually seen anyone use it. I don't know that everyone in the community even knows that TalkBack has heading navigation at this point. In VoiceOver, I think when we're talking about where'd it go? I have hold on a second. Let me bring up my slides. Here we go. So when we're talking about this these headings here, right? Heading 1 at the top and heading at the bottom. VoiceOver, if you use the rotor or you swipe up and down even, you can do heading navigation. So headings in iOS allow you to skip right over this pretty easily, and that's been something that's been around for a long time. So there is the concept that this is more prevalent problem in the Android ecosystem, and so that's probably why subconsciously I was focusing on Android. But it also wasn't intentional. It's just difficult to remember both platforms all the time.
Chris, I have a question.
Yep.
I'm the one that posed the question about the class 3 content.
Awesome. Let's talk.
Becoming awesome. Class. Yes. I mean, your carousel problem is very similar to the layout of a spreadsheet, except that we have hundreds of rows going across, going down with, maybe 100 columns going across.
Yep.
So my question is, it's not a carousel, but it's a spreadsheet. What is the best experience that you could provide for a disabled user?
Yeah. So you're talking about, so you're saying that there's that there's like can you mute or turn down your volume a little bit? I'm getting feedback. So I understand the question now for sure. So what you're saying is there's a collection of cells ultimately in like a two-dimensional grid, and so the headings of those cells is it's not class 1 content, it's class 2 content, and the class 3 content of the cells, and I think at this point what you're talking about is a different type of problem. So what and that is going to require its own topic. What you're talking about is a form of tabular data and spreadsheeting, and that in itself is difficult. The thing that you want to do, that there's multiple different ways of conveying information in relationships. The answer to how would I do a spreadsheet on mobile is I probably wouldn't. I would run away from that problem with abandon. But if I had to, if I was forced to, what you want to do is create relationships between the controls and differentiate between editing mode and viewing mode. And also it depends on how, so like there's a difference to me between like an Excel spreadsheet and the way I've actually seen tables rendered. In Excel spreadsheet, there's this thing in my mind where I have to get to like this infinite array of these row column relationships, whereas in reality on like, let's say like banking apps and things like that, there is this tabular data thing that goes on, but it's only 3 or 4 columns. And once you get to the point where you have 3 or 4 columns, the best way to handle that is actually usually to separate those things out and to actually announce the header. So let's use the banking app as an example, right? So usually in a banking app, you're going to have like account number, you're going to have your balance, and you're going to have your last payment or something like that, right? And those are going to be a really popular thing. So instead of saying account balance at the top and payment here and whatever, I would actually just repeat that every time. There's this tendency as developers to want to separate the rows and the columns and the row headers and the column headers and have them be like be independent, so that you don't end up announcing that multiple times, right? But as a blind user, a talkback user, or a voiceover user, the voice rate is going to be turned up really high, so that repetition of information isn't necessarily damaging. So in the case of Excel, again, the Excel spreadsheet, that can have lots of columns and lots of rows, and this would be a disaster because you'd be oversharing information and it'd be gross. You actually need to get to a point in an Excel spreadsheet where you have, all right, here's the cell, here's the heading for it, here's the row for it, and you would like probably append that to the content description, although I don't like doing that. In iOS, I would probably save it for the accessibility hint, so that the accessibility label is really truly just representing the pure name of the thing, and save any association for things like the accessibility value, the accessibility hint, all those things. And there's value. The value in that is make sure that the name of the thing is just the name of the thing. So in the example of an Excel cell, the text in Android and the accessibility value or the accessibility label in iOS is purely representing the name of that thing, and any other information that is used to associate cell header, row header, etc., that's all in another property. In Android, that property, I think, is role description, and in iOS, I think that property would probably be the accessibility hint. And so you take the cell value and put it in the accessibility label, and then you take the row header and the column header and append them together in the accessibility hint. And that creates a separation of responsibility, right? Because then the accessibility label is just in charge of representing the name and of that actual thing, and assistive technologies can gain value from that. They can see, okay, this is the name of this thing, this is what the text is, versus some of those arbitrary associations that you create because of an Excel spreadsheet. Again, I go back to there is a distinct difference between what I think an Excel spreadsheet versus tabular data, because tabular data on a phone is frequently going to be much more limited in scope than what an Excel spreadsheet needs to do. When you're talking about tabular data on like a banking app, what I would do is just group all that information together and copy those headings again, and just let that accessibility label, or actually the visual label too, just let it explode a little bit. It's more usable, and don't create this kind of tabular headings versus column headings versus row heading things. That is a design trope that has carried over from a laptop desktop environment that I just wish would go away. There is no need for table headings and column headings and row headings in a mobile environment. Just have one big focusable area that shares all of the information that you need, and repeat some of those headings.
Great, thanks, Chris. Another question here for you. You had mentioned in a previous office hour that Android users tend to use apps like Switch Access rather than a keyboard, and that Switch Access is sufficient for verifying keyboard accessibility. Could you please speak about that and any user research related to that to provide background for this question?
Oh man. Okay, so I could literally spend months talking about this topic, and so I laugh because I don't know how much of an answer to give versus how long to keep you all here. So context. Switch control is a technology that various forms of it have been around, but when you're talking about switch control in a mobile environment, I invented that in college. Sophomore year of college, we created a scanning keyboard, and that's the real crux of switch control, and is how do we allow people to type, right? And so we created this keyboard that grouped things interestingly and did some mathematical calculation on what the most common letters were at any given time, and you could readjust and analyze and things. So I do not want to dig into that too deeply, but know that when I answer this question, it comes from, I invented a technology that Google and Apple both use now, and I've done tons of research on how I understand this. So if you're looking for an authoritative answer on this question, no more authoritative answer can be had. And there's all sorts of, go Google, and that's all verifiable stuff. Google my name, Chris McMeeking, you can find all this stuff out there. So with that being said, I don't know if I have links to that stuff anymore, because this was all 10 plus years ago, but if it really needs to be shared and you're not just looking to verify the veracity of the answer, talk to me afterwards, because digging all of that up would be complicated. Now, as for why all of that is and what that answer leads us to, when you look at the way switch control and talkback distinguish focusability, talkback distinguishes focusability by calculating the combination of whether something has a content description or what I would call speakable text. So if you're looking at talkback and something has a content description or text or various other things that determine that it's essentially important for talkback to care about. And there's also a special property is important for accessibility that has this Boolean toggle, right? And it's a yes or no. And so basically the talkback focusability of a thing is determined by these obscure fuzzy things that basically are whatever Android developer on talkback thinks is talkback focusable is talkback focusable. And we can dig in and we can figure out what that is. When we're talking about switch control and the things that switch control cares about a much simpler set of things, right? Because when we're looking at talkback is dealing with someone who is blind using a device is a very complicated thing. We have to look at what do they care about informationally, what do they need to interact with, how do they want to interact with those things, can we improve that experience, what's a heading, how do we present visual data in a way that's meaningful to a blind user. There's all these different complications, right? When we're talking about switch control, it's much simpler. right? Switch control, the only thing that switch control needs to do is allow people to click all of the things that are clickable on the screen, right? If something can be interacted with, switch control cares about it. And if it can't be interacted with, it's not, right? Switch control doesn't care about headings or text or informative elements on the screen, because the presumption for a switch control user is that they can see. And if you have someone who is also blind, what you have is a talkback keyboard user, right? And so if you're testing with switch control, you have verified that someone who cares about the interactable things on a screen, you have verified that all of those things can be interacted with because it's switch control accessible. And talkback accessibility, talkback keyboard accessibility can be viewed as the subset of talkback users that also need switch control like help, right? And so if you can go in and you can interact, so now as a keyboard user, what do I care about? I care about things that can be interacted with. I care about things that are focusable. As a switch control user, what do I care about? I care about things that can be interacted with and things that are focusable, right? Can I put my input focus into that text box? Can I click on that button? Can I do this? Can I do that, right? And so is there additional value to testing with the keyboard? Sure. It's very, very, very minimal. If you look at the Venn diagram of problems that can be created, the problems that talkback has and the problems that a switch control user have are going to overlap like this, and the problems that a keyboard user can have are gonna be like this. And there is a little sliver of things down here in that Venn diagram that are problems that a keyboard user would have and expose that a switch control user would not have. But when you're talking about the value that you get from doing all of those testings, we're talking about catching 1 in a million bugs that are never going to show themselves. And there are actually a substantial amount of issues that a switch control user can have that a keyboard user cannot have, right? And so that is where I say testing with switch control before, if you're on that priority list of things, talkback, switch control, then keyboard would come after actually a bunch of other things. Now, if you're talking about we have no internal switch control expertise, well, yeah, then keyboard jumps up real quick if you're not testing with switch control. And so within there, I feel like I've taken this question various deep ways because the knowledge and passion about that old project. So at that point, I will say either I have answered your question, or I need you to be more specific so that I don't continue just going down something that I'm passionate about for no reason.
Great, thanks, Chris. Let's move on to the next question, one here. Mick is wondering, how does Deque assess native mobile applications, given that WCAG is based on web? What is our testing criteria? Or in other words, what do we believe to be the legal criteria for accessibility for native mobile applications?
Yeah.
Do you apply WCAG? Do you assess it against Apple and Google standards?
No. You've read enough of this question. The rest is conjecture and opinion. So the Mobile Accessibility Task Force, when we're in the Mobile Accessibility Task Force, and the Mobile Accessibility Task Force, part of the W3C, is in charge of creating documents that document how does WCAG map to mobile, and there are actually things in which you can say WCAG has a hard mapping to mobile in some areas and has a soft mapping to mobile in other areas. So when we're talking about how Deque does an assessment, when you look at the ways in which WCAG is deficient for mobile, WCAG is deficient for mobile in ways that are actually backed by UAG. When you look at the user agent accessibility guidelines, so the way web accessibility works, user agent accessibility guidelines and WCAG work together to allow browsers to communicate accessible content to individuals, right? And so the user agent accessibility guidelines go and they determine how the browser should talk with assistive technologies, and WCAG determines how application developers should create content so that UAG can do that properly, right? And so when you look at the ways in which WCAG is deficient, WCAG is not deficient WCAG can almost always be applied to mobile. It's just sometimes those WCAG things reference ARIA, which is a UAG thing, and they reference these things, right? But if you have an understanding of how WCAG actually means and how UAG communicates those things, you end up in a point where basically a native mobile application's accessibility violation exists not because of WCAG, but because of UAG, which is no less of a violation from the user's perspective. And so it's done by this combination of deep understanding of WCAG along with deep understanding of the deficiencies of a mobile environment. And we do all of those from the point of view of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We just have, particularly at DQ versus some of our competition, we have a deep understanding here of how those two things map and work together. And it is the working together of WCAG and UAG and that understanding that allows us to create more substantive mobile assessments, because we don't just have to ignore some of those things in which it appears that WCAG is deficient. WCAG is not deficient. WCAG and the user agent accessibility guidelines and all of those things work together in a more complicated way in a mobile environment, in a native mobile environment that requires a deeper understanding of those ecosystems.
Great, thanks. Another question here for you. Can you repeat the iOS and Android API again to support carousel accessibility?
Yes. So the Android Accessibility API is going to be a combination of the View Accessibility Delegate and the Accessibility Node Info Provider. And the iOS one is going to be the UI Accessibility Container Protocol. The other thing you can also do, and actually if our Android developer discovered that going in and creating those truly virtual kind of accessibility node infos and doing that in a purely assistive technology way was actually pretty difficult. I know you could do it, but it is tricky. It could also be possible to just render invisible buttons on the screen and only render them when TalkBack is on. So there's all sorts of solutions. If you're talking about implementing things and want to save time, a deep dive talk would be valuable. It's going to be difficult to understand all the scenarios. But if you want to do this from a purely overriding the accessibility information point of view so that you make no other user experience changes at all, it's accessibility delegate, and for Android, accessibility delegate and accessibility node info provider, and for iOS, it is UI accessibility container protocol.
Thanks, Chris. Another question here. How are you recommending getting from the top level of a carousel to the next level if swipe right takes users to the next item? Also, are you assuming that these carousels are static?
Hold on a second. I am saying that swipe right should not do that. What I'm saying is there should be buttons previous and next that you actually double tap on to get to the next item. So what I'm saying is, all right, so let's say that we have accessibility focus here. So I swipe right, I swipe right, I swipe right, I swipe right. I'm down here. Now that is for someone that wants to ignore the carousel, right? They don't care about it. What they could do on iOS, swipe down. Boom, right here, heading. Headings are awesome. They make things so much easier. So now let's go to the user experience where we care, where we want to navigate through items. So we do swipe right, swipe right, swipe right, double tap, click, click, next. This item has changed. You can announce the change of that item, or you can just allow people to know when they go back. But double tapping the next icon is how someone navigates through the carousel in this thing that I have drawn up.
Great, thank you. Another question here about carousels. For carousels that change the information automatically, where would the best position be to put a pause/stop button?
That is an excellent question. That's a really good question. The question was basically about, okay, we have this carousel and it's doing some auto scanning. It's doing some auto scrolling or something like that, right? And so then we need like a pause, stop, hide type of thing. You could do this a lot of different ways, and I would say it depends on your content. It can be a global setting that you have some, like, the 3 buttons thing up here on most apps where you say, hey, don't auto scan any content. You could do that here in like a global context menu type of thing. You could have the pause. If I were doing it within this control, within just this stuff here, I would want to see it before I saw the rest of the content. I would want to know that a common place to put it is like down here. And visually, you can still do that. You don't have to have the focus order match the visual order. It needs to not change the meaning. That's a WCAG criteria. But you can put that visually, you can put that pause thing down here and have it focus from here down to here and then across. That is perfectly WCAG compliant. Point being, as a talkback user, I want to know that I can pause that content as soon as is reasonable. And that's where I say global context menu is probably the one that I would use for my application. But I don't, designers and things, they're going to have opinions and stuff. So the concrete, the talkback user experience thing is, let me know I can pause that thing as soon as possible. That's the real problem to solve there.
Great, thanks, Chris. Another question here. On older Android versions that don't support the heading trait, how do you render the heading at the top of the carousel without hacking the label?
Just don't. The notice parentheses around heading here. The announcement of a thing as a heading for talkback is a misunderstood value. It does, announcing something as a heading does not provide an abundance of value. It is valuable, sure, but not valuable enough to hack it onto the content description. In fact, though, that goes against Android best practices for the platform. When you are talking about headings, the value of a heading is as a navigation landmark. Navigation landmarks are huge and crazy valuable, and hacking the word heading onto a content description does not provide that value. That value has to exist and has to be supported by the operating system and the assistive technology. And so what I would say is, do not do that. You haven't really added any value. And if there is an accessibility person saying, but WCAG, programmatic association of role, as in headings, is the WCAG criteria. And adding something like the word heading onto a content description actually does not adhere to that criteria. In fact, it creates an odd type of accessibility violation in which, like I said, headings are navigation items, right? So appending the word comma heading to a content description, well, you could hypothetically have an assistive technology that looks for the word heading and provides that navigation, but then what about switch control and the other assistive technologies out there that don't care about the content description, that only care about those other properties? You open up this weird accessibility debate bag of worms by doing things like appending traits and roles to content descriptions. It's just not worth it, especially given the fact that, as I said, the primary value of headings is as a navigational landmark, and that value cannot be there without the infrastructural support.
Thanks, Chris. Well, we are at the end of our time for today's webinar, but don't worry if we didn't get to your questions. I will send those to Chris so he can follow up with you via email, and we'll be sending out the recording and slides to you early next week. So thanks again for joining us today. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.